What do we get wrong about human reason?
That's a vast question. Um, so I think that it kind of depends on whom you're talking about. So if you're talking about the general public, or if you're talking about kind of academic psychologists and other
Hmm.
kind of experts.
Well, maybe academics first.
So academics first. But also that mostly applies to the general public as well. I think academics are quite well aware of the limits of human reason, and so for decades now, people who study the psychology of reasoning and of judgment and decision making have shown that when people make decisions on their own, when they try to reason on their own, their reasoning is subject to a number of biases, and in particular, human reason is subject to the confirmation bias, or what I think we should maybe call the my side bias, which is a tendency when you're reasoning about something to overwhelmingly find arguments that will support your initial point of view, your initial beliefs. So, if you believe that a given politician is better than another and you start thinking about politics, you will naturally conjure up arguments supporting the politician you like best. If you're thinking of buying a car and there's a car that you really have, strong feelings for, and you start thinking about the decision, you will spontaneously find reasons to justify buying that car. And so the existence of this bias and the issues it raises for how kind of poorly reasoning functions, really, in many cases, are well established. What I think most psychologists anyway, get wrong is the conclusion that they draw from that. From that, they just think, well, reasoning is flawed. That's just, the way it is. It's just kind of, that doesn't work great. What I think, and when I say I, that's kind of work that Dan Sperber, my former PhD advisor, and I have done together mostly, is that we should rethink what reasoning is for. So when you have a tool that doesn't work very well, instead of thinking, well, it's just a very poorly made tool, maybe you should think, well, maybe actually it's designed for to solve another problem than the one I'm now trying to solve with the tool. And so in particular, what Dan and I have suggested is that the function of reason would be social. In particular, to argue with others, to offer justifications, to offer arguments. And in that context, the confirmation bias makes a lot of sense, because if I'm trying to convince you, then I want to find arguments that will support my point of view. It would be kind of silly of me to think of arguments that go for your point of view and against mine. And so something that is well accepted and that is seen as just a flaw, kind of a weird flaw that doesn't really have a good explanation of how reasoning works, we see it as a kind of adaptive, as an adaptive feature of reasoning, and I think we can make sense of it.
A fascinating thing there is, if, as you say, a lot of psychologists might just accept that reasoning is flawed, there's something wrong with it, but then you might want to ask, why did evolution evolve a tool which is so imperfect, right? Especially if we often, think of humans as a kind of epitome of kinds of intelligence. Why then is a core faculty of our intelligence, as we often think about reason, flawed,
Yes,
right?
no,
And then that's
completely.
something you
No,
need to
no.
explain.
So, so you would expect every cognitive mechanism to be flawed in some way, because not being perfect would entail kind of infinite resources. So it makes sense that there should be biases and heuristics, so shortcuts that are mechanisms used in order to function more efficiently. And these will produce systematic mistakes. So if you think of visual illusions, if you put your visual system in an environment that is kind of weird, because the lines are not, are this kind of, they have this weird pattern, because you have this weird checkerboard or whatever else, your eyes or your brain will be tricked, and you will see things that aren't supposed to be there. But people who study vision don't take from that that vision doesn't work. On the contrary, usually they use these illusions to better understand how well vision works, and the kind of shortcuts and kind of tricks that vision uses to just achieve the wonderful results that it yields. The issue in the case of reasoning is that for most psychologists and kind of philosophers throughout the centuries, the function of reason has been to help people perfect their own judgments and their own beliefs and their own decisions. And so in this kind of Cartesian view of reason, you should be able to sit down on your own and think through problems, and usually you should, by doing that, you should be able to make better decisions, to arrive at better judgments and better beliefs. And so here there's really a clash between how reasoning actually works, the feature that it has, the effect that it systematically produces in the lab and in real life, and the function it is supposed to achieve. Like it's like you had a hammer, but every time you try to hammer something, it would be, because it's made of plastic, it was just going to fail to hammer anything. At some point, you'd have to think, well, maybe it was actually not meant to be hammering anything with this.
So if I understand this correctly, it's that reason has these kind of systematic flaws like confirmation bias, and it's okay to have some kind of biases and heuristics in any trait we observe, like reason. But then when we look at reason and we think, oh, as Descartes says, he looks into his own mind. All right, we're going to use reason, and then we're going to find all the flaws in my logic and the way I'm thinking, and then I'm going to get to the truth. But then if we have things like confirmation bias and maybe even, and then many other kind of ways it's flawed, which you could maybe even talk about, it's like, how is the trait supposed to help you in your own mind? It's
Yes, exactly. There's a complete mismatch between the function that reason is supposed to have and its features. And if you think of any artifact or anything that is supposed to have it, that has evolved in the case of reason, or that has been made in the case of an artifact to serve a function, then its features should fit with the traits that it has. So then again, in the case of the visual system, even the apparent mistakes the visual system makes when you perceive a visual illusion, actually it reflects how well the system functions. The fact that it's really clever about picking up on cues, that in 99% of the cases things like it's going to help it function better. But then if you're a clever, kind of vision psychologist, you can create these weird patterns that are going to trick your vision. But it's a way of revealing how well vision works. Whereas in the case of reasoning, there's a complete mismatch again between the feature, like how reason actually works, and the function it is supposed to serve.
So tell me then, your work, what function has reason evolved to solve? How should we think about it, conceptualize it, if not in this way that we use reason in our own minds? There's something different, there's something weird about how and why reason has evolved.
So according to us, reason would have evolved to serve kind of social ends. So we know that one of the main things, if not probably the main thing that kind of makes humans stand apart from other apes and other mammals more generally, is our ability to cooperate and to communicate and to kind of coordinate with other humans. And so we have a language that is completely different and vastly more powerful than any other system of communication in the animal kingdom. We can understand each other's minds. We cooperate on vast scales. So all of that are things that other animals and other apes and primates more particularly are mostly unable to do. I mean, they're just much less good at it than we are. And these abilities we have, they create kind of a different environment in which different kind of cognitive mechanisms will be selected for. And in particular, if you're in an environment in which you will be cooperating with other people, you'll be working with others, to hunt, to gather, to raise children, to do all the things that our ancestors were doing and that we still do. For instance, you need to be able to talk to each other, and you need to be able to figure out who is right and who is wrong. And so we can't just trust each other completely. So if the two of us disagree, if we don't have a way of figuring out who is right or who is wrong, then we're just going to stick to our guns, and neither of us is going to change our minds. So at least one of us is going to lose out by not changing their minds when they should. Whereas if we are able to exchange arguments, then even in the absence of trust, or when trust is not sufficient, people can, I can give you arguments and you can figure out for yourself whether the arguments are good or not. And it's something we do constantly, like we don't realize it always, but whenever you have every kind of slight disagreement with your colleagues, with your family, with your friends, spontaneously you start arguing, you start defending your position, and they will evaluate your arguments, and they will either they will give you a counter argument or they will change their minds. And this is super useful. Like communication would be much more rudimentary with that ability. And the other reason, I think, the other kind of function we think that reason serves is, which is very kind of closely related to argumentation, is justification. So people justify themselves, they justify their views, they justify their behavior so that other people are able to evaluate them more appropriately. So if you do if I do something that looks a bit silly or maybe a little bit kind of immoral or problematic in some way, instead of just being judged negatively by others, I can try to explain my behavior. I can tell other people, look, I did this, I punched the guy, but he had punched me first. I didn't do the dishes, but it's because, you didn't do them last week. Like we can, give reasons that are not always, very good, but we can give reasons for our actions and our beliefs so that others can judge us kind of more accurately.
Right. So we're always giving reasons. As you say, with the dishes but it's interesting because in anything we do, there's always so many stories we could tell about why we did one thing or another, and then so it's interesting if I then understand. Okay, so we'll have all these justifications and arguments. This is how we're often using reason. And then so imagine we then do turn that inwards and we start thinking about, let's use reason in our own minds to kind of solve a problem, say, and get to something, because we almost turn that narrative inwards, right, in ourselves. That's also something interesting about us humans. But if we do that, you're saying there's some way in which that's not why reason has evolved. Reason evolved to help convince others, to justify ourselves. So even though we can turn it inwards, it's not exactly its original function.
Yes, that's our claim. So for us, reason would have evolved both kind of to convince others and to justify ourselves, as you are saying, but also to evaluate other people's justifications and other people's arguments, so that you can tell whether you should be convinced or whether you should change your mind about whether someone else's actions were appropriate or not. And so then again, the way we can distinguish these two hypotheses about the function of reason, whether it is something that is more social or more kind of pure kind of ratiocination, kind of purely individual skill, is by as we were saying earlier, looking at the features of reason. So if you take these two functions, for reason to work well, to serve these two functions well, it should have very different features. So if reason had evolved to help us think on our own better, then reason should be very impartial. They should be very objective. You should be able to weigh the pros and cons of various decisions. You should be able to criticize yourself and to think of reasons where you might be wrong. You should be quite exigent towards your own reasons and make sure that when you offer a reason for a belief that you hold, it is a very good reason. Otherwise, it's completely pointless. And what we observe when we look at how reason actually works is that it does exactly the opposite. So on the one hand, it has this confirmation bias or this my-side bias that we mentioned. And in addition to that, it's also quite kind of lazy, lazy in a smart way, but in the sense that when you first think of an argument to justify your views, people tend to be relatively happy with quite kind of shallow, superficial, not very, very good arguments necessarily. Not anything kind of completely stupid, but things that we're not like natural Ciceros, able to have very long series of arguments that link to each other and that anticipate counter arguments. We kind of spontaneously, we kind of suck at this. It's hard to learn to do this, and so we're quite lazy usually. And you can see that if you read YouTube comments or whatever, the average level of the argumentation isn't going to be great. And then again, that doesn't really fit with this more kind of individualistic view of reason. And just to kind of preempt a potential counter argument there, at first sight, it might seem as if that also doesn't fit with our view. Like if you think, well, if reason has evolved to convince others, then we should be very good at making arguments. But in fact, for us, reason has evolved in the context of dialogues and of exchanges with others. And so it's fine to start a discussion with an argument that's not great, because if it works, then you didn't have to bother to look for a better argument. And if it doesn't work, then if I disagree with you, I give you a mediocre argument, you're going to tell me why my argument sucks, and I'm going to have to come back with a better argument, or you're going to tell me more precisely why you disagree with me, and I can address your kind of more specific disagreements and counter arguments. And so in the context of a discussion, starting with something that is not great and just improving as the discussion proceeds is quite sensible.
Right. So if reason is helping us interact with others, then we don't need to put a huge amount of effort into convincing people. It's kind of about, if it's easy to convince someone and it's a very plausible reason, then everyone can go forward doing what we're doing. But if and so then it's interesting because, for example, Descartes, or people think, reasoning is a really powerful tool. Would you say that in a way it can be if, once we get into arguments, there is a way in which, on the surface, like, our everyday discussions, we might have some reasons that are not actually particularly insightful or, amazing. But, tell me about, because, it's interesting on a societal level, humans are, again, seen as a highly intelligent species, right, that actually is capable of solving a lot of high-level social problems and coordinating with each other. So are there benefits to reason? If we can reconceptualize reason in this way, is there kind of benefits and power to it?
Yeah, so obviously our abilities, like the fact that we're able to coordinate and to solve a whole lot of problems at the societal level, it depends on many of our abilities. Ability to exchange information, to collaborate with others, to track information, to accumulate cultural information, to learn from others. So it's not just reasoning, obviously, but reasoning certainly helps in the sense that many experiments have shown that, as well as a host of real world examples. When you put people together and there's nothing really to hinder their ability to exchange arguments, then in the overwhelming majority of cases, good things will happen. Like if you take people who are, they need to be of somewhat good faith, like they need to want to figure something out, and they need to somewhat disagree with each other. Like if everybody agrees, it's not great either. But if you have a disagreement, which is usually when people start exchanging arguments, obviously, then whoever has, like the best ideas will tend to prevail, like, the best insights. And if it's not always just one person who has them, you can combine the insights of different people, but they will tend to prevail because they are the ones that will be supported by the best arguments, and they will convince others, and then others will share these ideas, and they will spread. So then it's not a perfect mechanism, and there will be exceptions, but on the whole, it works quite well.
I see. So, if because a byproduct of reasoning being so important for social justification is that I will be convinced by good arguments, right? And similarly, if I give a poor argument and someone goes, no, this is a terrible argument for this or that reason, then I'm going to be forced to make another argument, or else sort of my case falls. So right, in this iterative way, or if we're with people that slightly disagree, have different opinions, then you could say overall the group has the potential to be smarter and solve more problems than it would have sort of if you just had individuals by oneself.
Yes, no, completely. So as an aside, so it doesn't mean that we're favoring some kind of group selectionist argument. Like it's just the group is better off because every individual in the group is better off. So it's just like a byproduct, the fact that the group is better off. But if you take part in discussion with people of good faith who can exchange arguments, at the end of the day, everybody should be better off. So most people will have better beliefs, unless one of the group members was had the perfect correct answer to start with, and then it's mostly the other ones who benefit from sharing that. But usually it's more complex, and bits of insights are kind of shared throughout the group. And what argumentation and discussion allows is to share these insights and to combine them in many cases for any kind of complex problem. Something that, as you were saying, no single individual might have been able to think of.
It's interesting that, so you mentioned that, imagine a group selection argument in that everyone will benefit overall, even though, you could imagine individual cases where you actually would rather, you could somehow convince people of your intuitive thing you want to do without having to give good arguments. But there's a way in which overall we've evolved this really good capacity to evaluate people's arguments. Is that right?
Yes, and that's precisely because we didn't evolve through group selection. And so people, are mindful of their own interests, and everybody's interests, kind of diverge to some extent. And as a result of that, you can't just trust other people. Like, you can't just take people's words for it in many cases. And so if you could just trust people, you wouldn't need argumentation. You can just say, well, I believe this is this, and then people would believe you because you would have no interest to kind of lie to them. And so whoever is the most confident, essentially, could just impose their views because it would make sense for everybody to believe them. Whereas for us, really, it's everybody is out to defend their interests, because they think they have better beliefs, they think their ideas are better, they want to convince others, but they also want to have good beliefs and make good decisions themselves. And so if someone else offers something that is better and they have better arguments, then it is in their interest to change their minds. And the exception to that, and that's why I think argumentation often has a bad press, is that in some contexts, people don't really care whether they're right or not that much, because their decisions and their beliefs are not going to have any kind of impact on their well-being. What they care about is their reputation. It's purely their reputation. So, sometimes you're going to have a heated argument with someone, and if it's about something kind of political, some kind of intellectual thing, something quite abstract, it's not going to really impact you either way, whether you're wrong or not. What is going to impact you is whether other people think you are right or not, and whether other people see that you're able to defend your views, whether other people realize that you had been mistaken. And so in these cases, it makes sense to some extent to hold on to views, even if we're exposed to good arguments, to at least more or less consciously realize that we're wrong, but just to pretend that we're right, just so we can kind of save face.
Right. Interesting that would particularly be the case in academic, intellectual arenas, where there are so many as well different potential ideas, and people have as well careers and things at stake, and so it's kind of like not backing up an opinion, which kind of is maybe actually based on the argument, is kind of seems to be collapsing under its own weight and doesn't seem to be true. It's like there's no immediate even like piece of evidence that could really confirm it either way, and then it's a bit abstract. So who exactly is gonna, it's not about what the tribe is gonna do the next day or something that's really important, right?
It doesn't, like if I change my mind about the academic theories that I have about reason, it's not impacting my everyday life in the slightest. So whether now what in a way the way it would impact me is through my reputation as a scholar, rather than through how I'm going to do my groceries, or how I'm going to pay the bills next month. So unfortunately, the incentives for academics, but for really many people in many circumstances in which their income or their livelihood doesn't depend directly on them being right or wrong, but more on how other people perceive them. The incentives to be right are they're a bit skewed. But to the extent that you have an audience that is somewhat kind of impartial, just kind of looking at how things are going, you don't necessarily have to convince directly the person you're talking to. As if you're able to convince the audience, and if the audience it starts to become unreasonable to keep holding on to a view, then people are kind of backed into a corner, and maybe somewhat reluctantly they will have to admit that they're wrong. Otherwise, they will lose even more kind of credibility. So and you can really see that this kind of continuum of the quality or the convince or the kind of the quality of arguments throughout the different academic fields. Like in mathematics, arguments tend to be very consensual. Like usually mathematicians who are able to understand a given proof, they will tend to agree fairly quickly, like in the overwhelming majority of cases, on whether the proof is valid or not. And someone who would be like, say, no, I don't believe that proof is valid, and they can really defend their view, if they're faced the whole community, they would lose credibility very quickly. Whereas in the social sciences, where the quality of evidence and of arguments is much lower, because the material we're working with is different, it's much easier for views to persevere for a long time, because it's harder to both kind of to convince directly researchers, but also just to convince the broader audience that a view is just completely false.
And like taking this then and just going in a slightly different direction, is that you have arguments against these kinds of dual systems theory, models of almost we have an intuitive way of thinking, and then a reasoning, a system 1 and a system 2, and that system 2, that side which you can almost apply more cognitive power and solve more problems. You kind of don't think that this is a right way to think about even the brain, the mind more generally.
No.
Tell me a bit about why. Why don't we have a capacity, even if it's not through reasoning? Why can't we apply more cognitive power to think more about problems? Especially as that seems to, for me, it kind of feels like, even we often talk about humans have meta consciousness. We have some ability to think better than other animals. How should we think about the brain differently?
Well, so I guess the big insight from cognitive psychology really is that, and from evolutionary psychology to a large extent, is that the brain and the mind are to a very large extent kind of modular, and so they're essentially, it just means that they're made of different mechanisms that have different functions, and that function in relative or in kind of quasi-total isolation from each other. So it doesn't mean that obviously they take input from each other, like your visual system is going to inform your belief base, which is going to inform how you make decisions. But every mechanism, it takes the input and it doesn't look at anything else. So it's very much like a piece of code, like a traditional piece of code when you have all your functions and they take their input and they deliver their output. But they're not wondering about all the other variables that are in the system. Otherwise, nothing would ever work. And so if you look at the mind that way, it's not that humans are better at thinking in general, because there's not such a thing as thinking in general. There are many different cognitive mechanisms that serve different functions. And so, we are better at reasoning. Indeed, maybe we're the only animals that reason, at least in the meaning that Dan and I use the term. We are the only animals that communicate as well as we do. We are the only animals that do kind of theory of mind, or kind of mentalizing, understanding other people's beliefs and mental states as well as we do. So all of that, we do better. But we can't just, the idea that you could just think harder, it would just evolutionarily, it would be weird, because essentially thinking is free. Like it doesn't, like your brain uses up a lot of your energy, but 20% of your kind of baseline energy is used by your brain, and even more when it grows. But you don't use more energy essentially when you use your brain more. Like when you're engaged in a very cognitively taxing activity, you don't really use much more, because essentially much more energy in your brain. And so if just thinking harder could solve all your problems, then we just do that all the time. Like it would be silly of evolution to provide us with this tremendously costly brain, and then once you've spent like a quarter of maybe of the nutrients you eat during your childhood is just to build that brain, and then once you have it, it's like, we're not going to use it now. So that would be a bit silly. So no, we use our brains as well as we can in the circumstances that we are in.
Right. So I guess there are kind of some, I just think about studies where, they have almost cognitive reflection tasks when people, there's some intuitive way of thinking about a problem. And then if you do it's almost like they're trying to trick you. And then if you do kind of think,
they completely try to
trick
you.
Yeah, they're trying to trick you. Well, it makes me think of the visual illusions that you talk about, right? So the vision has heuristics and biases, and it's actually really effective. That's the fact that we have to, the brain has to do that, has limited resources, and so similarly you have these tasks where would you say they're these then tasks which if you can avoid the trick, you get them right? Are they almost playing on the fact that we have intuitive processes for understanding problems?
Yes, no, they're very much. So should I give an example just to flesh that for people?
Maybe, yeah.
So the most famous of these tasks is called the bat and ball, and it goes something like this. So you have a bat and a ball, they're worth $1.10 together, and the bat costs $1 more than the ball. And so how much does the ball cost? So you can think about it if you want now. But the correct answer, the answer that overwhelmingly people give is 10 cents, because you just do $1.10 minus $1, and the correct answer is 5 cents. 10 cents doesn't work, because if the ball costs 10 cents, then the bat that costs $1 more has to cost $1.10, and then the two of them together cost $1.20 when it should be $1.10. Whereas if the ball costs 5 cents, then the bat costs $1.05, and the two of them cost $1.10. So all is in order. And indeed, you can see how People are given two numbers, and given how the problem is framed, clearly you have some kind of subtraction to make, and so you subtract the two numbers. Also, the numbers are chosen so that the subtraction is very easy. You have $1.10, $1, the 10 cents kind of really pops out. And in many cases, these heuristics would work. So in many, kind of similarly worded problems, this would be kind of the correct answer. And so this is the kind of problems that has been used, as you are saying, to say, well, look, if people just thought harder about the problem, then they would improve, and they would get to the correct answer. So that's not the case, because essentially if you give people more time, it doesn't make any difference. If you pay people to give the correct answer, it doesn't really make any difference. And in fact, what experiments by my colleague Wim Denis and his students have shown is that the overwhelming majority of people who give the correct answer, they actually, it's quasi-intuitive for them. Like they get at it very, very quickly, and they don't necessarily go through the 10 cents phase. So the people who first think about 10 cents and then correct their own answer, there's very, very few of them.
Right. I mean, and perhaps one could learn to do that. One could learn to correct one's answer, but that makes me think that if you were to then go to like another setting that was similar, would that learning apply? Would you still
It would not
be able to?
People who
it wouldn't. It doesn't.
When you teach people how to solve it, they will then solve other like very, very similar problems. If you give them another trick problem, they won't solve it. But essentially there's a trade-off in how much you should kind of double check your own answers. Like, imagine like if you went about your life, and every time you have a clear intuition that there's a correct answer to something, you would double check it. You would lose a massive amount of time. Most of our intuitions are correct. Like, if you imagine every time you see someone, it's like, oh yeah, I think this is John. Like, is this really John? Am I really sure this is John? You couldn't function. So we have to. Our intuitions are overwhelmingly reliable. And so we're completely warranted in trusting them, in nearly all the cases. And so, systematically questioning them would be vastly kind of silly. And so it makes sense that we don't do it. But then when you have these problems that in which your intuitions are mistaken, then you will get it wrong. But that's the price of efficiency.
Right. It's interesting that, yes, some people might intuitively... So when they get a question right, if you think about how they solved it, those actually quite intuitive for them anyway. And it makes me think that if you're the kind of person that can solve it intuitively, go right ahead. But again, because this is a very specific problem, like in general in your life, if you're going about and... I just like that thinking of, if we could use more cognitive power to solve more problems, wouldn't we just like always do it? Oh, whoops, I forgot to use my extra cognitive brain power. I guess I'll die.
I know, that's why this whole thing about people only using 10 or whatever % of their brain is really silly. Like, it just makes no sense at all.
Right. This talk about the capacity of reason. You have another book called Not Born Yesterday about, I haven't read it completely, but it's about reason and sort of as applied to the fact that we're actually quite good at intuitively understanding whether or not we can trust people, which I find fascinating. So maybe tell me a bit about that.
Yeah, so as we were saying, reason has these two facets. So one is when you're trying to convince others, and the other is when you're evaluating someone else's arguments. And so when we think about that function of reason, of evaluating other people's reasons, then it is part of a broader set of mechanisms that Dan and some colleagues have called kind of epistemic vigilance, and that in the book you mentioned I called open vigilance. And the function of these mechanisms, of these kind of cognitive, kind of psychological mechanisms we have, is to evaluate what people tell you or what you read. And so they will look at the content, so they will look at whether what people are telling you is plausible or not. They will look at whether people are experts or not. They will look at whether people have good arguments. They will look at whether people have, incentives that are aligned with yours. And they will combine all of these cues, and what will pop into your mind essentially is when someone tells you something, you have an intuition as to how much you should accept it. Whether you should just, take whether, if you're telling me, well, my birthday is on, whatever date, then I will immediately accept it because I have no reason, first of all, because you're supposed to know your own birthday, and you have no reason to lie to me about when your birthday is. And so I will tend to just take that as a fact. By contrast, if you tell me that you're a finance genius and I should transfer all of my savings to you, I have no reason to believe you're a finance genius. There's a clear conflict of interest, so I won't do it. And so, this is obviously like two extreme cases, but people much more, and including kind of very small children, make much more kind of fine-grained distinctions between not only between people, but most importantly, I guess, between situations. So the same person you will trust in one domain and not in another. You can trust your friends or your family member with your life in some context, but if you start playing poker with them, you won't believe a word they're saying. So we're very sensitive to differences between individuals and between contexts, in deciding how much we can trust others and what information we should accept.
Interesting. So, and I mean, at the start of that book, you kind of have this anecdote of kind of being just scammed by someone who's, there's some plausible argument, I need this money from you, and so we often have this view that we might be kind of gullible, that people can be tricked, that because again, like, there are a lot of flaws in psychology. It's one is able to find biases and heuristics in everything that we do, so but does this kind of go against that actually we're quite good at it, and as you say, we need to be as well, right? Evolutionarily speaking.
But I mean, we are good because we rely on heuristics and shortcuts. So we're not. Then again, we can't be perfect. And in particular, in the case at hand, essentially there are two types of mistakes you can make when you're evaluating information. So either you can accept information that is false or that is kind of harmful to you, or you can reject information that is correct and that could have been beneficial to you. And I think that people tend to pay a lot of attention to the first type of mistake. So when people accept things that are false. But I think that the much more common type of mistake is when we reject things that are true. So essentially, if you take all of the people who have views that are kind of mistaken and kind of socially harmful to some extent, like people who don't believe in vaccination that has been proven effective, people who don't believe in climate change. Overwhelmingly, these people have been exposed to correct views and they have rejected them. And so that's really the main problem that we have, is that because the mechanisms we use to evaluate information are imperfect, we will make some mistakes. But the type of mistakes we make are usually of the type of rejecting too much information or failing to trust people when we should have trusted them.
Right. So, I mean, would you say in the scenario where you reject climate change and there's a lot of evidence for it, but you do it anyway, that what is really the cost to the individual of doing that? Especially, it's such a big issue. It's not something where they're not a climate expert that's doing it, so they don't have impact on policy or anything anyway. So who cares?
Yes. For each individual, it doesn't matter. At the societal level, it does, because policies are based to a significant extent on public opinion. So if public opinion in Germany had been less opposed to nuclear energy, Germany would be in a better state now, for instance. So it does matter in the aggregate, but what you're saying is right in the sense that my own beliefs don't impact me, like the content of my belief doesn't impact me directly. So whether I believe in climate change or not, it's not going to make a difference. It's not going to make a difference to how I am impacted by climate change. I could fly a jet every hour of the day, and that would not make a difference to whether I will suffer from climate change or not. I mean, don't do it, but it's just so. But it, so it's not what matters more is as we were saying earlier, the reputational consequences of your beliefs. Like if you're, in a circle of kind of well-educated people and you believe that climate change doesn't exist, then people are going to think you're stupid and morally bankrupt. By contrast, in other circles, believing in climate change might be problematic because other people really don't believe it. So the main stakes are social, and so that's why, to some extent, it's still important to have arguments, because in the aggregate, if you have good arguments, that many people are increasingly going to realize that, okay, well, actually it makes sense to believe this, and they will judge negatively people who don't believe in it. But it's it's just a different process from when things really kind of matter to you, when it's a decision about what products you're going to buy. It's quite different.
Oh, I see what you mean, right? So I mean, it can have social consequences on you. I mean, we can definitely be impacted by, I'm this religion because all the people around me are this religion and things like this. But you know, you might. So if I'm understanding you correctly, though, yeah, if I'm gonna be giving all of my money away to someone who, tells me that they're a financial expert, we're less likely to do that because there's no, unless I'm trying to convince this person that but again, it's like the costs are just way too big. And so is it a case of we're really good at kind of avoiding things with these high costs? We really just don't want to die. And, there are some small issues where we don't need to have that much vigilance on it and about exactly whether we're right or wrong.
Yes,
Is that right?
completely. I mean, there obviously we're if I read something in the news about a distant galaxy or that astronomers have interfered at something, and it turns out that it was a spoof or some hoax. Like, okay, well, I got tricked, but maybe I looked a bit stupid, but the cost isn't very large. But obviously, if I give all of my savings to someone who just kills them, that's gonna impact me much more directly. So, so we are much more. So it's not. I mean, we just, there's essentially like a needle between like, okay, I'm just going to tend to accept things because what's the cost of accepting them, versus I'm just going to tend to reject things because the cost of accepting them would be very high if they were false. And that needle changes based on the domain. So there are domains in which, it's fine if you accept no things because there are no consequences to you, and there are other domains in which you should really be super careful. And broadly, that's what people do. And like. Because we've all heard of cases like Madoff and people giving all or at least a substantial portion of their savings to people who turned out to be running a pyramid scheme or something else. But when you look at the detail of the story, like the degree of credibility that the scammers have is, at least in the case of Madoff and in other similar cases, is tremendously high. That these people are really well integrated. They have these are people who are regularly dealing with the SEC. Like, these were people who you'd have kind of every reason to trust. And so it's not as if people were just giving all of their money to some random guy in the street. Like, they were giving their money to someone who it was quite reasonable to trust them. And it would be in the same way that someone who says, well, I'm just going to keep all my money in my mattress and I'm not going to put it in in the bank and use index funds or whatever. That person would be also very, very silly because they would also lose a lot of money, but in a way that is less visible, maybe.
This has been great. So just one thing I'm interested in is your future work. So all this on. Are you still working on reasoning? What does the future look like for you?
A bit. So the thing I'm working on now is science. I'm trying to sort of make sense of science in a way that. I mean, so I'm an evolutionary psychologist, so I see humans as having evolved from other apes, and when you think about humans that way, the fact that we're both kind of interested in science and that science actually works is really amazing. Like, we are apes. Like, we're just we're not that different from chimpanzees. I mean, obviously we can speak better and we can coordinate better. But if you look at what humans were doing 300,000 years ago, which was already impressive by many accounts, the fact that a little while later they would be interested in quasars and in neutrons and nucleotides and in all of these sort of things, and they would be able to understand them. It seems completely crazy. Like, I don't know if you've read this. There's a very good novel. I mean, I feel bad because I'm kind of spoilers ahead. Called Children of Time by Aidan Tchaikovsky, in which people send it's kind of sci-fi novel. People send a virus that can accelerate evolution towards people becoming smarter, and they're supposed to terraform a planet and to put some primates and to send the virus. So the primates become very, very smart very quickly, but the ship with the primates kind of drops off. It doesn't work, but the virus gets to the planet and it infects spiders instead. And the spiders become really, really smart. And after, you can see how, and they happen to be visited by the last kind of humans that are left. And they visit them from kind of every century maybe or something. And at first they see there's these giant spiders. And then a century later, they have these webs that are covering the planet. And then a few centuries later, they have, spaceships and whatnot. And it's just, to us it seems like, well, it's impossible. I mean, they're spiders, but we're not different. Like it should be impossible for apes to build spaceships and to have tools that can actually perceive the beginning of the universe. And so I'm just trying to think about this and to try to make sense of this.
Yes. Like, it's kind of taking what we were talking about in terms of reason and this almost distributed improved cognition, but then how does that it's stabilized in institutions? We can keep building on previous science that we've done, and yeah, even also the limits, as you say. It's like, okay, we can make arguments, we have language, but why should those capacities be able to comprehensively understand such abstract phenomena? There's not seemingly some direct evolutionary explanation you can give for it. Doesn't seem that evolution as a process can really predict that this is something that could have happened.
It's clearly not what we evolved for. Like, we did not evolve to understand quasars and whatnot. So the fact that we're kind of interested in that at all, and not just interested in having friends and finding mates and finding food, and then that we're not only interested but able to figure it out. Like, it's funny how much, like, because there's a hindsight. So now it's like, well, obviously sure, people do that, but even if you look at 400 years ago, there was no science as we know it didn't really exist, and so it was far from obvious that anything like it would ever develop. And if you look at 10,000 years ago or something, it was like, obviously we're never going to be able to understand that stuff, and who cares anyway? Like, I want to eat now, which is why don't stop talking to me about stars.
Right. And that concludes this podcast. If you want to check out any of Hugo's books, I'll put some names in the description. I really recommend his work. I've loved it for a few years now, and so it was really awesome to speak with him today. I haven't really introduced myself on this channel. I'm Jack. I study economics, and I kind of just want to talk about loads of different areas. So economics, but also philosophy, theology, cognitive science, and more. So if you're new or old, watching for a couple months maybe, then hi, and I hope you stick around. Hopefully maybe you can enjoy some of the episodes featured here, and have a good day. Thank you, guys.